Hello, everyone. My name is Alan from the Modern Musicology Podcast, and welcome to Happy Birthday, Walrus, Paul McCartney at 80. This panel is part of the BritTrack content for Virtual Dragon Con 2022, and we are celebrating the birthday of one of the greatest recording artists ever. We'll be discussing Sir Paul's extraordinary career with the Beatles. We'll be talking, of course, about the recent documentary Get Back. We'll be talking about his next band, Wings, and him as a solo artist. We'll talk career highlights, favorite albums, and some of his significant contributions to modern pop culture. And I have a fantastic group of panelists that are joining me with this. So, Rob, how you doing?
Hey, how are you?
Fantastic. Mr. Porter, how are you?
I am good, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Ryan, how's it going?
It's going good.
Excellent. And my buddy Anthony.
Howdy.
I didn't call you A-dubs, but I might.
You did not, but now you already have, so it's on
Right.
the record.
Exactly. All right. So Mr. McCartney has had an extraordinary career. He's just hit his 80th birthday. He's been in music for 60 whatever years. Just finished a major world tour, capped off with a headlining performance at Glastonbury. A 3-hour show that was packed with, it was basically a career retrospective, packed with Beatles songs and solo hits and some Wings songs that he hasn't played in a long, long time. So it was just a phenomenal show. We're going to talk a little bit about that career retrospect, about his early days as the Beatles. And before that, we're going to talk about his solo career and Wings. We're going to cover it all as much as we can in an hour. Mr. Porter, if you don't mind, give us a little snapshot of who Paul McCartney was in his early days leading up to becoming a Beatle.
Okay, so James Paul McCartney, to give him his actual given name, was born on the 18th of June, 1942. And in keeping with family tradition, he was given the same first name as his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. But to avoid confusion, the family always referred to him by his middle name, which was Paul. So he is actually, as I say, officially James Paul McCartney, but we all know him just as Paul as the family. So Paul's father, Jim, was actually had his own jazz band. So Paul grew up in a very musical family, and once he originally started to play music and was interested in music, the first instrument he played was actually the trumpet. But he always tells the story that he gave up the trumpet because it put a blister on the lips, and he didn't think the girls would find that very attractive, kissing a guy with a blister on his lips. So he picked up the guitar instead. He started to play around with the guitar, and he lived in an area just not too far away from certain other people he would meet later on. Grew up in a suburb of Liverpool. His father ended up working at an engineering works. His mother was a midwife, and she traveled around. And unfortunately, she died fairly young of cancer. Paul lost his mother, and it was actually after losing her that he picked up his guitar and wrote his first song. So that sort of spurred him on, and he eventually went to school in Liverpool called the Liverpool Institute, and there was a couple of people that he met that would become very influential. One was a young guy who used to travel on the same bus, who had an interesting guitar, a young George Harrison, and the other one was a friend called Ivor Bryce. It turned out that Ivor Bryce was actually also friends with another aspiring musician from a different part of Liverpool, a gentleman by the name of John Winston Lennon. And it was Ivor Bryce who suggested to Paul that on the 6th of July, 1957, he should accompany him to a fete at a local church where his friend John and his band, the Quarrymen, were playing. And this is the momentous day in rock and roll history when Paul McCartney and John Lennon met for the first time. I will say that's the documented first meeting. There is actually anecdotal evidence from Paul that he did actually know who John was, and that they would see each other in the local fish and chip shop and sort of nod at each other and say hi, but that was about it. But this was the first time they actually had a sort of a formal meeting and a real conversation. The story goes that Paul was very impressed by John on the stage because John was singing blues songs but didn't know the lyrics, so was making up lyrics as he went along, which impressed Paul. And then afterwards, during a break between the two sets, Ivor Bryce took Paul backstage to meet John, and then depending on who you believe, Paul says that he played Eddie Cochran's song, which I actually don't believe, because the song he talked about would not been released in the UK at that point in time. I think that's just anecdotal that sort of got into Paul's memory. But one thing is very clear, that they realized they had a love of rock and roll. Paul picked up John's guitar and retuned it for him, because George's guitar was tuned like a banjo, and Paul retuned it actually for a guitar. So that impressed them, and John was impressed by Paul. Certainly sang a song. It might have been a Little Richard song, we don't know, but there was something that happened there that John was impressed with Paul, and Paul was reasonably impressed with John. And again, depending on who you believe, either John asked Paul right there and then to join the Quarrymen, or he told his friend Pete Shotton that he wanted Paul to join the Quarrymen, and Pete met Paul a couple of days later in the street and asked him. But whatever the upshot was, within about a week, Paul had been invited to join John's band, the Quarrymen. And over a period of time, the Quarrymen morphed through, I think about 18 different lineup changes before it actually got to the Fab Four that we all know and love. But that's really encapsulating like 6 years of history down into a couple of paragraphs.
So this question is open to everybody. And talking about the Beatles, and in those early days, Paul and John were primarily the force behind this band, certainly as songwriters. I'm curious to know what you think is the strength and weakness of each one of them. How they definitely counterbalance each other. They work together a lot. As the years went on, they started to write together a little less. They started out in a room, just playing songs to each other and coming up with parts together. And that sort of, diminished a little bit over time. What do you think the strength and weaknesses of each one of those? How do they complement each other, and how do they counterbalance each other? Anybody jump in?
Okay, I'll go. I was going to hang back, but okay. Yeah, they did start writing very early. Almost as soon as they met, they started writing in notebooks. And the tragedy is there's about 120 lost Lennon and McCartney songs that were in notebooks that Paul's then girlfriend, Jane Asher, accidentally threw away at one point. So God knows what we lost. But they would write stuff in these notebooks and be at each other's houses. But interestingly, when they started to play, they were very much a cover band and really didn't play any of their own material, even though they had stacks and stacks of it lining up. I think really you can't separate Lennon and McCartney, I think, because the result is the sum is greater than the parts. And even all four of them, when they eventually got together, I think the sum is greater than the individual parts.
Yeah.
I think John bought the introspection, he bought the emotion, Paul bought the professionalism, he bought the melodies, he bought the wider range of music. John was definitely a rock and roller. Paul had been raised in a house full of musicals and jazz, and he had an appreciation of music on a wider scale. He played a wider variety of instruments, but John was really the emotional raw soul, I think, of the Beatles. And the two of them complement each other. I think you can see that with their solo work. John's is very visceral, and Paul's is occasionally way too, and maybe we'll get into this, but way too sentimental at times. But I think together they really produced something that was greater than the sum of the two parts. So.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said, Alan, because I tried to look at the later output and parse out who brought what. And my initial hypothesis was John was a lot rawer than McCartney. But then I realized that McCartney was the primary writing force behind Helter Skelter, and that theory just went right out the window. And it's one of those things where I think in the beginning, as you say, John was probably more of the rock and roll side, even though McCartney did have an interest in it, and as you said, initially impressed him with either a Little Richard or an Eddie Cochran song, who knows which. But McCartney brought other influences too. I think you're 100% spot on. But as time went on, they started to kind of meld their styles together to the point where things that you would think might have been Lennon songs in the later output turned out to be McCartney songs, and vice versa. So yeah, completely agree. Very, very difficult to pull them apart.
Yeah, and if you read some of the later interviews, even between the two of them, they don't agree as to who wrote what on certain songs.
That's true.
Yeah, I think it's a case too of at the beginning they sort of didn't have defined roles and worked very much in tandem. But as time grew on, a little bit of each other's songwriting style and way of thinking about songs sort of rubbed off. You can tell that, you know, when you go to Liverpool, one of the things they tell you on the tour is that, you know, when Lennon entered the McCartney house, it wasn't always like, oh, great, he's here, right? Whereas Paul was always a little more viewed positively. So I think that even though they're both from the same class, I think McCartney was a little more upper middle class in how he presented himself. And I think that comes across in some of the writing. It comes off as very more educated and sophisticated, whereas like Anthony said, Lennon's a little more raw. But I think that those two sort of eventually just even each other out. And then you get Harrison coming along later, and that throws another interesting voice into both of their the way they write music and the way they create songs.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, Harrison and Lennon definitely have the raw, the deeper thing. But you know, the Beatles would never have been as big as they were without Paul McCartney. And that just some of that the catching lyrics definitely had more of appeal to the masses, and also just Lennon and McCartney's the harmonies. You just didn't have that in any other band. That really set the Beatles apart.
Yeah. So jumping toward the end a little bit, it's kind of become old news at this point, but it's almost like obligatory to bring up Get Back. So I'm curious to know what your big takeaways were from that documentary, but specifically, what did you learn about Mr. McCartney from watching that documentary?
I'm going to very sheepishly admit that I still haven't had the time to watch it.
Oh, Anthony. A-dubs.
I'm going to say that I did not realize sort of just how much business acumen by that point McCartney had with looking at things, in that he's very much looking at every aspect of the Beatles musically, but also businessly and promotionally. He's kind of looking at like, okay, how do we market this? How do we present ourselves? How do we get out there? And he is very, very in tune with what his contemporaries are also doing to record records and handle their business, right? And get their records merchandise. And McCartney was very much at that time involved in sort of making sure that the image of the Beatles that they wanted out continued to be that image, very hands-on. And I never really realized just how sort of serious he was, right? Because you always think, oh, they're just having a lot of fun. And you get these moments of that documentary where you can just see them having fun again. And that's what I really liked about it. But I think that, you know, the big takeaway with that is that, you know, McCartney very much has his sort of vision for everything, not just the records that they make.
Yeah, I think what came out to me in that, you're right, it was great just to see them in the studio having fun and being, particularly the second half, once they actually relocated back to the studios at Savile Row, was awesome to see that. But actually also, to your point about Paul, was the fact that he seemed to be the reluctant leader. Yes, he had the business acumen and he was thinking, but he picked up that mantle after the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, and didn't really want to do it. I think there was a couple of times in there where he said something like, well, somebody had to be the leader, and I've sort of gone into that role, but it's not something I actually really want to do. And I think that caused some of the friction that was going on. But for me, the mind blowing moment, and it's the one that everybody points out, is just that bit where he pulls Get Back out of thin air. For 30 seconds, you just watch the creation of this classic piece of music just come together, and it is pure magic. I love that, but I also loved seeing Linda and Mary McCartney and the kids and stuff interacting with the rest of the band. Everybody talks about the fact that Yoko was there getting in the way. Well, she wasn't just there. Everybody brought in guests.
Yeah.
Maureen Starkey was there, Linda was there, the kids were there, and just seeing the whole band reacting as a family, I thought was great. But particularly around Paul, and for me, there was that magic moment, and there was also the saddest moment, I think, was when the morning that after George had quit, and then the following morning John was late and didn't turn up, and Paul's just sat there with Ringo, and he just very quietly says, "And then there was two."
Yeah.
And his face just falls, and I was like almost reaching for the tissue box at that point, because it was, really got to the heart of he'd seen this magic thing that they had just like collapse around him and felt useless. So I think it really revealed him as a much more rounded human being than we tended to give him credit for. I think.
Mm-hmm.
So.
One of my favorite about the thing you're just talking about the wives and the family members and stuff all hanging around. One of my favorite moments was they were just kind of sitting around jamming with Yoko singing with them, and they were clearly having a great time. So it kind of hints to the fact that the whole Yoko influence is way over exaggerated as far as their demise, and Yoko broke up the band and all that stuff. It was interesting to see those moments where it's just some people sitting around with guitars and pianos and having fun.
Yeah, and there's a point where I think it's just Yoko and Paul. He's actually accompanying her and stuff. Yeah. It was so interesting. It was very enlightening to see. But the Get Back song. The other thing that I was really interested in is you're talking about Get Back and watching its like creation into the universe, and how different that song almost was, where it was almost a commentary about the racism going on in England. Get Back to Where You Once Came From was about people of other nationalities. Get out of here. And the other one was Carry That Weight, almost was a jokey song for Ringo. It's just amazing to watch not only the songs develop, but the ideology behind those songs change as they go. It's amazing. Yeah.
And I love the fact too that you can just watch that transformation of a song turn on a dime. Like they don't have to say anything; it just happens. That amount of like syncopation and just like being able to read each other was just. I mean, we knew it was there. We knew that it was something that has kind of always been with the band, but seeing it actually happen was really cool.
Yeah, that bit with Get Back, I mean, Paul sort of pulling it out of the air, and you can see Ringo's watching him, and then Ringo gets to the drums and stuff, and George sees himself at the side looking completely bored, and at some point, something clicks in George's head, and he picks up the guitar, and it starts adding to it, and it's like, it's just magic watching all these layers come together. Yeah.
So, speaking of Mr. McCartney,
unintentional pun, then, sorry.
Yeah.
Speaking of McCartney as a member in a band, as a musician in his own right, talk about what you think are some of his strengths and weaknesses as a bass player, as a composer, as a lyricist, as a performer. What do you think is special and unique about Paul McCartney, be it with Beatles, be it with Wings, be it with his solo band? What do you think are the unique qualities about Paul McCartney?
One of the things I like about him is, I mean, in the early 60s, the bass guitar was a fairly new instrument. People were still learning how to use it. And, the fact that he was, he probably one of the most influential bass players out there, just his, his ability to play and his, riffs and stuff are still, classic, that, it's kind of standard stuff that everyone, you just want to learn how to play.
I would say his songwriting. I mean, that's what people come back to time and time again, both as a partnership with Lennon, but then you look on and what he did with Wings and what he continued to do as a solo artist. the fact that what he wrote, be it on his own, be it with John Lennon, be it with others, has influenced so many bands over the years. I mean, I think that is candidly his biggest strength, is just his sheer ability to write a phenomenal song.
Yeah.
I'd actually go around with his all-round musicianship. I think that comes down to the songwriting, the fact he can play. He's done 3 albums where he basically plays everything. Even in the Beatles' early days, when they were having drummer problems, he would sit in on the drums. He could play. In Hamburg, he started playing the piano. Like I said, he played the trumpet earlier on. I mean, he's just total all-round musicianship, which I think leads, and also the great songwriting, the ability to wake up with something like Yesterday just running around in your head, or Blackbird or something, is just amazing. But going back to the bass thing, many years ago, I decided I was going to learn the bass because of Paul McCartney. I will say I ended up owning a bass. I wouldn't say I played it. But my bass teacher was, talking about McCartney and the fact that, most bass players just play to the beat, or they play the through line of the song. But if you take McCartney's isolated bass tracks, he's actually putting in melodies and riffs and stuff, and actually helping sort of, again, build those layers of the song and the music as it goes forward, and applying his musicianship to something that was really seen as just providing that supporting rhythm. And he takes it to another level and continue to do that. But
yeah, he takes a more kind of jazz approach than what lots of people would think of as a traditional rock approach, right? That Phil's not just playing root notes. I mean,
thank you, root notes. That was the
that's a
phrase
very
I was
different.
looking for. Yeah.
It's a different style, and it's one that, again, hugely influential. You see a lot of it in things like punk later on. And that comes from him. You wouldn't necessarily think of McCartney influencing the punk movement, but there you go.
Yeah. I love the fact that his sense of collaboration is interesting. Also, his just ability to in his late 70s and 80s. I mean, I saw him a couple of years ago, so he was probably 75, 76 at that point. And he knew where his voice was. So he knew, okay, how do I change these songs to work with my voice so that I make them work? Because he very easily could have done, I Want to Hold Your Hand with his current voice, have it be garbage and not cared and cashed in. But he was very careful to make these songs tailor around his range, which I thought is interesting. And I love the fact that he's still an ordinary guy. There's all these stories at Glastonbury of bands, these young bands that are playing, and they're looking on the side of the stage, and there's Paul McCartney just standing there watching them play, right? And then after the set, they're like, "Hey lads, that was great," And then, they're like, "Paul McCartney just said hi to us, right?" Jack White just did this amazing set at Glastonbury, and apparently he walks off the stage and he's like, "I was scared to death because Paul McCartney was watching," right? Then there's these stories of the Pet Shop Boys were on their way walking to the studio to record, and McCartney pulls up in a limo, rolls down, and says, "Hey boys, need a ride?" And he's just kind of known for going to the same bookstore and grocery store in London that everybody else does, right? So I kind of like that. I just kind of like that he's got a Sir and he's a Beatle, which is a double weight of the world, right? Because you're a Sir and a Beatle. So he's got a lot of outside responsibilities, but he still has time to do collaboration, still be an ordinary guy, and still do the charity stuff he does as well. I just think around it's a really interesting package on how to be a showman. We have very few around now still.
I agree with that. There's so many photographs taken of him. You're just sitting on the train on his way to London or whatever. There was a great video that was going around. I think it was Christmas last year, where he was back in Liverpool. He'd taken the train to Liverpool, and then he'd gone to see his brother Mike McCartney, who lived out in the Wirral, and he was stood at the bus stop outside his brother's house to get a bus back to Liverpool. And somebody sort of driving by in their car stops their car and has the camera out, and it's like, "It's Paul McCartney," and he's like, "Hi, how you doing?" He's just waiting for the bus. I mean, my God, how amazing is that? So
Another thing,
no entourage, no bodyguards. A lot of these younger rock stars could learn a thing or two about.
And it's not to be dark, but considering what happened with George and John, not having bodyguards is really, really ballsy.
Yeah. Yeah, but you know, I think he's one of those guys that, you know, if you see him sat on the train and you know he's got his scarf on and his hat on and he's sat with his nose in a book, you're like, that guy looks a bit like Paul McCartney. No, it can't be.
Right.
So no.
Yeah. Another thing I love about McCartney as a musician is, he's self-taught. He never took any music theory, but just he knows what sounds good to him and just has an ear for just amazing, just notes, harmonies, keys.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. He has such a knowledge of music. He just absorbed it from all these different sources growing up. And he may not have been formally taught, but he understood music. Like he just had this intrinsic knowledge of how music works. And because of that, I think he had an impeccable sense of melody. He had an extraordinary sense of chord progressions, how to build a song. His compositional strengths, I think, were great. He was just on a different plane than what you would normally think of, particularly at a young age, as rock stars. So, Rob, you talked a minute ago. You mentioned the Beatle tour that you did. Can you just tell a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I have been to Liverpool a couple times. It's probably one of my. I'm weird. I really love the North more than the South, but
good for you. That's a northern lad. Good for you.
So having done Liverpool the first time, we did. I saw the statue, did the Cavern Club, did all the sites sort of on my own, finding them. Right. There is a tour. It's like the Magical Mystery Tour. I think that something that cops off that. And we had some friends of ours from Southport, and we're like, all right, we're going to take the tour. So we took the tour, and it was supposed to be an hour and a half, and it was like 3.5, which was lovely because the guy's like, you guys all really know what you want to see, so we're just going to keep going. And they take you to, all of their houses, and you get out, and we saw the house where John grew up in. You saw George Harrison's house. Some people, I don't know who they were, might have knocked on the door, and the nice lady showed them in and walked them around George Harrison's house, which was awesome. And you kind of see the sights, and they show you like, okay, this is the bank from Penny Lane, this is the roundabout from Penny Lane, and then this is Strawberry Fields. And you don't realize that Lennon and McCartney, to get to each other's houses, had to go across Strawberry Fields. So that song is really important to them because it's sort of like their meeting ground of where their music and their lifestyles both sort of intersected, right? And it was really fascinating to sort of just learn the dynamics of the Beatles growing up, because what I knew about the Beatles was, of course, the Beatles becoming the Beatles and the Quarrymen and the time in Germany and starting off. But the early phase of the Beatles and Paul growing up, you don't really get that story, right? And just how attached they were to growing up in a city that was very working class and very, they both had a chip on their shoulder because in general, Liverpool has a chip on its shoulder, right? And that really influenced their music, and I think I thought that was really interesting. And it was really interesting to learn a lot about how they worked. They would go to each other's houses and play instruments. They'd be in school and they'd find ways to write music. They got a gig, I think, at Alan, you'll know this more than me. They got a gig at their school, and apparently John was treating it like he was a rock star already. And Paul was like, calm down, John, we're not famous yet, And then, you go to the Cavern Club, and sadly the Cavern is kind of touristy now. But the big thing when you go in the Cavern Club is just like, wow, this is really small. This is like what a great bar looks like for a bar band to play in. It looks like someplace you just go see your local cover band play or your favorite bar band play. And it sort of hits you then, they were a bar band, right? They weren't like the biggest band in the world at that time. They were a band just making money to be able to go out and play the next gig. And you just never think of the Beatles like as a regular band, right? Which I thought was really interesting. It's just sort of like demystifying them in the early days of playing live and playing out.
Rob, it's interesting you say that. One of my father he was born in the 40s and grew up in the 60s, and one of his best friends went to university at Liverpool in the early 60s and was a regular at the Cavern Club. And his big claim to fame in this little town in Wales, where he eventually moved back to, was he saw the Beatles at the Cavern Club in those early days. And, at the time, they were just another band. You could tell they had talent, but they weren't the Beatles yet. They were still,
No. So I would say one of the reasons I actually wrote my book before there were Beatles, which actually is about those 4 years, Rob, it's about them as teenagers and getting together and stuff, was I was at college in Liverpool. And I would be hanging out at places like Penny Lane, Strawberry Field. And this was before we got the Beatles Disneyland stuff part of Liverpool. It was before Liverpool really acknowledged the Beatles. And we'd be hanging out in nightclubs, listening to people like Elvis Costello as he was starting out and people like that. And we'd hear these stories about the Beatles. And, the amount of people that saw them at the Cavern Club who say they saw them at the Cavern Club.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Have been twice, 4 times the size it actually is.
That's the first thing. Is like, I think everyone in Liverpool says they saw the Beatles.
Right? Yeah, but there were so many contradictory stories. That's what actually sparked me to write the book. It's like, I've got to go research this and actually find out from primary sources what the stories are.
And the other thing exactly. The other thing that's interesting though too is that you get the Cavern Club, and then later in Liverpool you get a club called Eric's, which births all these like sort of, and it's very much a city of playing live music, and it's very much a city of like not musicians playing music, if that makes any sense. And that's great because you always think of the Beatles as being like sophisticated and genius, because you get to those late records where it's all technical and it's just like, no, they're just guys that own instruments that went out and played. It all sounds very punk rock, but it's
they were very, very punk rock.
It's very it's very much DIY, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that they did too, and I think Alan, this probably is in your book too, is that they were able to play Black American music in clubs and nobody cared, which I think is really fascinating for that time that they were in.
Well, of course, they were getting a lot of the music from the ships coming into Liverpool from America that actually used to use 45 RPM and 78 records as ballast, would you believe? Unsold records, and they would turn up in Liverpool and the seamen would take them off the ships. And that's how they got access to a lot of the early R&B and soul and rock and roll records, was because they were being shipped into Liverpool. Yeah.
And let's be fair here. I mean, that was the Liverpool scene in general. You look at the whole Mersey beat thing, and it wasn't just the Beatles. That entire musical scene kind of adopted that kind of, as you put it, Rob, that Black American sound.
Yeah, I mean, at one point the Beatles were actually felt as being the worst band on the Mersey beat scene when they first word got out that they were first going to Hamburg. The lead singer from Derry and the Seniors was basically, for God's sake, don't send the Beatles over here. They'll spoil the cush gig we've got, because they were deemed as being a really poor, bad band. They didn't even have a drummer at that point. So
and I
wasn't it expected that probably Jerry and the Pacemakers would have been the biggest? Is that what they thought at the time?
Or actually, the biggest band in Liverpool at the time was Ringo's band, which was Rory Storm and the Hurricanes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because when you hear the early recordings from that time, and there still are some from the Cavern Club and some other, you're like, they don't sound good. And initially you're like, it's the sound, it's the analog, and then very quickly someone like Alan, who is older and smarter, tells you no, and they sort of tap you on the hand, they weren't actually that great. They had to get great, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing I don't think people understand, is even the Beatles had to get great.
They got great in Hamburg when they were playing 10 hours a night sessions.
Yeah.
And I think, circling back to McCartney, I think that coming from a background where you have to work to be famous, he's never stopped working to make his music. He has this idea in his head, I think, that you have to be treating music like, for him, it's not I don't think it's a business. I think for him, it's a job. And I think that he just sort of like looks at all the stuff that comes with it as what you do. And I think that those early years, especially those early kind of failures, I think that really shaped him, because I think later he had the ability to fail miserably and still be Paul McCartney, right? I was listening. Alan's going to shake his head. I was listening to "Give My Regards to Broad Street" the other day, getting ready for this panel, and it's not McCartney's finest moments, but and that record absolutely tanked in the U.S. after the one hit from it. But he's still Paul McCartney, and he's still unfazed. And I think that those years of struggling, when you look at John and later even a little bit with George, I think that really shaped them all as musicians.
Okay. I said that we were going to do a top 5. Did everybody pick a top 5? All right. So top 5 albums from Mr. McCartney from any period of his career. Beatle, Wing, solo, anything. Who wants to go first? Ryan?
Sure. As far as I guess from Beatles era, I always loved Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. Just the experimentation. I love the later Beatles and just some of the sounds they were able to create. Yeah. As far as Wings era, always loved my dad had Band on the Run on vinyl, so I used to listen to that growing up all the time. So that always had a soft spot for that. And then Wings at the Speed of Sound was also another good one.
That's a great one.
As far as his solo stuff, I had a hard time trying to decide what my favorite of that was, but probably Ram. I always loved the Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey.
Yeah. Excellent. Anthony, you want to go next?
Yeah, Ryan basically stole my thunder because on my list I had it as Sgt. Pepper, Band on the Run, Wings at the Speed of Sound, The White Album, and Abbey Road. So we were only one different, and that's for many of the same reasons. I'm a lot more familiar with the Beatles and with Wings than I am with his solo output, although I would like to give a shout out to McCartney 2, which had Coming Up on it, which is where I get the obligatory Sparks reference, because of course in the video to Coming Up, he did an impression of Ron Mayle. Got to get the Sparks reference in.
I was going to say every panel discussion comes back to Sparks somehow.
It's either me or Rob that does it. But I mean, that's a great song. So if I had to include something solo, I think I would go McCartney 2 just for Coming Up. Regardless of the video, it's a good song.
Right. Rob, how about you?
Okay, this is where this all goes to hell.
Great.
So obviously, Sgt. Pepper. It's not the first Beatle album I heard, but it's probably, at the time I heard Sgt. Pepper, I'm sort of a deviant little punk kid that's heard a lot of soul records, right? And it just absolutely mesmerized me and fascinated me and just made me completely rethink about music. That, Pet Sounds, and a couple of records by the Kinks just completely made me rethink about music. But I just remember I was engrossed with the album cover and trying to figure out who all the people were. I was trying to figure out where all the references were in the songs, and the fact that it's all bled into each other, and that there's that really great piano ending at the end of A Day in the Life, where if you're just a sad, miserable bastard, that's perfect. So that's my favorite. Then Band on the Run, because I grew up, I was 5 when Band on the Run came out in '73, but I remember my brother and my sisters and everybody in my house going nuts about that era of Wings, right? And I grew up, hearing, sort of not intentionally, but in the background, hearing Wings records on the radio, and just Wings is kind of very much around in my childhood.
Oh yeah.
And I love just the flow and the way that Band on the Run just turns and twists and does all kinds of different things. And there's other great songs on it too, but I just love the third one, Strawberries, Oceans, Ships, Forest by the Firemen, which is Paul McCartney in youth. Paul McCartney had finished a solo album, and he was looking for a producer, and he was recommended to Youth, and Youth and him got together and sort of worked on the tracks, and then he invited him over to his studio to work on it, and then him and Linda ended up there all night just watching him work, and they made the Fireman record, which some of it's electronica, some of it's rock. It's just weird and kooky and great. So I love that. And then also, I'm trying to figure out how to pronounce it, but it's Choba BCCP, his covers album. Because at that point, you know, he's Paul McCartney. He can do whatever he wants. He probably wants to do a covers record, right? So it covers like Eddie Cochran and Duke Ellington and Little Richard and Fats Domino. And he just plays all these songs of his youth. And you hear a musician that has sort of gone through everything with the Beatles and his solo career. And he could I'm just going to play the records I want to play. They're other people's songs, but I'm just going to play whatever the hell I want. And I just thought that was really cool. And then Ram, mainly because when I first heard it, I didn't love it. When I heard it the second time, I didn't love it. It got remastered. And after they remastered it, I really got into it more. I don't necessarily think it's as cohesive as some of the other records, but it's just really ambitious. It's also a family record for McCartney, the way him and Linda sort of work on it together. You sort of hear this going on. And I just kind of feel with that record that Linda's kind of like, well, you're not John, but you're here, right? That's just kind of, but there is a kind of weird warmth to that. Yeah, so those are my 5.
Awesome. And Mr. Porter, how about you?
Okay, so top of the pile.
Awesome. I'm glad somebody brought props.
Actually, not my favorite Beatles album, but it's I think it's the most McCartney of all the Beatles. I mean, it's his idea, his concept. I think he drove Sgt. Pepper. Number 2, guess what number 2 is going to be? So, for me, this is the perfect album. We listen to this all the time in our house. It's just be CD, vinyl, whatever. It's on almost constant rotation in our house. So, yeah. Okay, this is where I break ranks slightly. Okay, my number 3, talking of him doing cover versions, Run Devil Run.
Oh, yeah.
Him going back to his rock and roll roots, but bringing along Dave Gilmour from Pink Floyd to play guitar with him. A whole bunch of cover versions plus 3 original rock and roll tracks. So this is very cool. One of my favorites.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Flaming Pie is actually one of my favorites of his solo ones. This actually inspired me to do a manga series, would you believe, called Flaming Pie. Which is I pitched it as Buffy meets Scooby-Doo to the music of Paul McCartney. And unfortunately, the publisher went bust just as we got picked up, so it's never got made. But there is an Ashcan edition going around at various cons, so there is a Flaming Pie manga out there. And then this one, I'm going right out. We're talking about experimental music, Liverpool Sound Collage.
Yeah, the Super Furry Animals one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that almost made my list.
Yeah, he did this for Peter Blake, the artist who created the cover for Sgt. Pepper. And this is him. It's actually some of the Get Back sessions, some unused tracks from Sgt. Pepper, some of his orchestral music. And talking of Paul McCartney being a guy of the streets, he literally went out into the streets with a microphone and interviewed people on the streets of Liverpool about what they thought about Liverpool, and then put some of the results into this mix. It's a weird electronic mix, experimental, and it actually got nominated for a Grammy for Best Independent Album of the Year. Paul McCartney getting a Grammy for Best Alternative Album of the Year. So,
you know what I love, Alan, is I was working in an indie radio station, and they sent promos of those to college and indie radio, and I was filling in for a guy, and the guy who was on before me was much younger, and I was really excited to see this. I'm like, oh, it's that album with Super Furry Animals and McCartney, and it's going to sound weird. And the guy's like, I know who Super Furry Animals are, but who's Paul McCartney?
Nice.
And I it's one of the few times I just stood there and I just shook my head and left a room.
It's like all the kids on Twitter after the collaboration with Kanye saying,
yeah,
who's
Kanye,
this Paul McCartney guy? Kanye's going to make him famous.
Right. All right.
Alan Seiler, I have the same question for you. What's your favorite?
Yeah, what's your top 5?
I'm deviating a little bit from everyone else's picks.
Oh, good.
Which is good because we need a good variety of stuff. So for my solo album pick, I'm going to 1989 with Flowers in the Dirt.
Ooh, nice.
It's
Good
not
one.
one of the ones that normally gets, nominated in this kind of thing, but I absolutely love it. It's just a collection of really great songs. My Brave Face, Rough Ride, Figure of Eight. This one, so good. And it just had a great production. And the thing that I really love about it, I always loved it. Like when it first came out, I just was immediately in love with it. But then, what was it, 2 years ago, it got reissued in a remastered form with all these demos. So you hear all these songs in their raw form, which is just like acoustic guitars and stuff. And it's fantastic. So that's one that I highly recommend. I've got 2 Wings picks. And I almost went with Band on the Run, but I knew somebody else would pick it, and maybe more than one somebody else would pick it. So I went with my second favorite. Well, it actually might be my first favorite, and that's Venus and Mars, a phenomenal album, just a fantastic, solid collection of songs. Had one big hit on it, but the whole album is just phenomenal. The thing that really started everything for me. So as I've said before, I grew up at a time when the Beatles were already gone. I knew the Beatles from the radio as 4 solo artists, and Wings was my Beatles. And the thing that first hooked me was the live album, Wings Over America, but the concert film Rock Show, which is basically the film document of that album. And this is still my favorite concert film ever made. It's one of the best live albums ever made. I was really new to Wings, and I knew some stuff, but I got that album and I learned a whole lot more. I learned a lot of Beatles songs that I didn't know. As a kid, I knew Octopus's Garden and Yellow Submarine, and I know I'd heard Yesterday and Long and Winding Road, but this one introduced me to Lady Madonna and things like that I'd never heard before, and some Wings deep cuts that I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then I had to go and buy those albums. So it was transformative for me.
And I love Lady Madonna. That's like the way they sort of invented the break on Lady Madonna, I just think is terrific.
Yeah. I didn't know where to go with Beatles. I figured somebody would say White Album, so I didn't do that one. I mean, every one of them is going to get mentioned. So just top 2, I picked Sgt. Pepper because it's just amazing. And as Alan Porter mentioned, it was really driven by Paul. It was a concept that he had in mind. It's just a great album. But the top one, and possibly the top album ever made, is Abbey Road. This is just a monumental record and one of the greatest albums ever made. That whole side 2 suite is just spectacular. I'm a huge George fan. This has possibly the 2 greatest pop songs ever written, and they're both George songs. I mean, just a solid collection of stuff. So I'm sorry we didn't have time to really get into solo material and Wings and all that stuff, but we are at the end of our hour. So I need everybody to quickly say where people can find more of you on the internet. Rob, go.
You can find me with these 2 fine gentlemen here on the Modern Musicology podcast and our new partner, Stephanie. Also, the Weekend Justice podcast for needcoffee.com. Wednesday nights from 7 to 9 Central on KDHX is Juxtaposition, my radio show. It's streaming online, so if you're like Alan and you're podcasting all the time, you can listen later and on the archive stream.
All right, Mr. Porter.
So, as I mentioned earlier, Before They Were Beatles is a book that you can find on Amazon and all good online bookstores. It is also now a podcast, which you can find Before They Were Beatles on your favorite podcasting platform or directly at anchor.fm/Before Beatles. We've just started season 2 covering the Beatles' arrival in Hamburg. Good fun stuff. And if you want to just follow me for my writing generally, you can follow me at alanjporter.com, and that has links to where you can find me all over the interwebs.
Awesome. Ryan, how about you?
I'm on Facebook at Ryan Carey. If you're on the BritTrack Facebook group, you can find me through there. Hopefully you are a member of the BritTrack Facebook group. Otherwise, I'm also on Instagram at Ryan Carey 494.
All right, A-dubs.
All right. Like Rob and Alan Seiler, I'm part of the Modern Musicology podcast, so you can hear my thoughts on a plethora of music topics on a weekly basis. I'm also one of the 4 hosts of the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension podcast, in which we are watching our way through all of Doctor Who from 1963 until now. We're, at the time of recording this, coming to the end of the John Pertwee era. And you can also find us at on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Watchers4D.
Awesome.
And as for the podcast, you can find it wherever you like to get your podcasts, really.
Awesome. So I am, of course, on Modern Musicology with Rob and A-dubs. And we talk all sorts of, we've talked about Beatles before. We talk all kinds of music topics. I have a small publishing company called Cosmic Press. And you can find that at cosmicpress.com or at Cosmic Press at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I have a Star Trek podcast called Earth Station Trek. So I just want to say thank you all so much for spending this hour with me and chatting about the Beatles and about Mr. McCartney in particular. Viewers, thank you all so much for watching. You can find more about the BritTrack on Twitter at BritTrack, Instagram at DC BritTrack, YouTube and Facebook, just search The BritTrack. And thank you all again. This has been so much fun. And for closing parting thought, I will say, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Everybody take care. Have a great day. And if you're at DragonCon this weekend, when you're watching this, come visit all of us at panels. We will be looking for you. So take care. Have a great one.